Hello, and welcome to the Argyle HR Leadership Forum. My name is Nick with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. A couple of notes before I turn things over to our panel moderator. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during today's event and for the following week. Our partners are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. At any time during today's event, you can visit their virtual booths from the main agenda page, which include complimentary materials, information, and meet and greet opportunities. To ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat, and we will address your questions at the end of the session. Now, without further delay, I would like to introduce our moderator, Monique Jefferson, Chief People Officer, Community Preservation Corporation. We're super excited to have Monique and our panelists for a panel discussion titled Measure, Adjust, Grow: Talent Analytics Strategies for 2024. Welcome, Monique. Over to you.
Thank you, Nick. Appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. Very excited to have the opportunity to moderate today's panel. Today, I am joining you from our offices in New York City. Before we jump in and get started, I want to allow our esteemed panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves. We'll start with Donald.
Yeah, thanks so much, Monique. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. Again, as Monique just mentioned, I'm Donald Avery. I'm the Human Resources Officer for a major Fortune 200 company. And I'm also located, of all places, in Chicago. And I'm really happy to be a part of this panelist discussion and look forward to our discussion. I'll turn it back to you, Monique.
Thank you. Ekta?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Monique. Pleasure to be here joining the discussion on this very important topic for the era we are in right now. So Ekta Vyas is my name, and I am the Chief HR Officer for an academic medical health system located here, situated here, speaking from Los Angeles, California. Looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you. And Tracey?
Hi, everybody. I'm Tracey Tiska. I'm Senior Vice President of Human Resources at McGraw-Hill, and I am based on the exact opposite coast of Ekta. I am in New York City with Monique.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we'll go ahead and get started and jump right in. So my first question for the panelists is, what do you think are the most important aspects of marrying organizational data to workforce strategies, and why? We'll start with Don.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Monique. Yeah, when I was reading through this question, it's a very interesting question itself, especially in today's market and world we live in now. You know, I take a look at it and look at data. Data overall is king, especially now more so than ever before. And however, it's really important to realize that in 2024 versus maybe about 10, 15 years ago, data has now become even more synthesized. You know, you hate to only make decisions also based upon data, only to find out that the data that you've been tracking and going over is not the right data. So it's really important that we take a look at how do we look at data, how do we measure it, and making sure that we have checkpoints to make sure we're not doing the wrong thing. So we have to be careful when it comes to overanalyzing data, as I mentioned, and be careful of where you get your information from. That is critically important. Is it quality, reputable organizations that you actually pull this information from? And then I am very cautious of using artificial intelligence now in today's world, because it's still kind of being reestablished. You got Chat GPT and you got other forms of artificial intelligence out there. So it's really important that we take a close look at where do we get our data from and how do we utilize it. And then the other point is learn to measure the desire of what I call desire of individuals, the will versus skill versus just doing testing, because there are different ways in which you can measure that information and data in the person versus just always looking at test. And the last point I wanted to make is that with the shrinkage in the labor force today that is upon us in many organizations, it's really important that we build a culture that enables people to be successful, and it also will result in overall better success and companies to succeed. Okay.
Thank you. Hector, Tracey, anything else to add?
One thing I would add on to what Donald said, and this is particularly on the AI piece, right? I mean, we're just sort of seeing that get started. But I think we need to be ready as HR professionals to make sure we're able to kind of flex in how we use information we're getting through AI. I think that while we're just getting started there, so are regulators. They're also just starting to think about how companies are using AI in hiring decisions or even other aspects of the with employees. So I anticipate, right, as we move forward, we're going to start seeing more and more regulations. And I think we need to be on top of those and be ready to pivot in order to always stay, compliant with how we can use AI.
Absolutely. AI is just the tool. And particularly from a recruitment standpoint, if you're going to use the AI tool, you also want to make sure that it is not, you're trying to remove to the extent possible any inherent bias and also any unintended negative impact or impact against under-marginalized communities when you're using the AI tool as well.
Good point.
Yeah, well, Monique, I'll add a little bit of my perspective here. Your question's important aspect of marrying organizational data to workforce strategy. And I believe it's a very significant question for today's HR when you're talking so much about technology and data analytics, because data is the key to unlocking the strategic side of HR. I think our biggest, aspect when you're marrying organizational data is truly recognizing that you're marrying organizational data to strategy to drive some kind of a decision making, right? The challenge, and of course, what you brought up about artificial intelligence in HR and all of that, there's a lot out there with a word of caution, right? In regards to, yes, it sounds good, tons of things going on there, but the real practical aspect of the decision-making component in driving strategies and free of bias and free of, violating the legalities of how you should be managing your workforce and talent. And I believe that from a decision-making perspective, marrying that data to organizational strategy, you really have to understand if you're evolved enough in data analytics, which most organizations are not. There's tons of research and technology coming our way, but if you look at the reality of organizations, I think I read a research report from Deloitte, which was in 23, which was 23% are really at a place where they're using data analytics to drive decision making in organizations. And then most of the organizations are at a descriptive analytics. Descriptive analytics is basically what has happened, what has already happened in the organization, right? So I think when you talk about marrying data to drive organizational strategy, you really need to look at, where is your maturity, or if you're not there, how do you drive it forward to go from descriptive to either prescriptive, then there's predictive, then there's diagnostic, and all of those have different components. Is what are you trying to look for in the data to drive decision making, and then can you with certainty say that that's a statistically valid, valid result for us, so we can inform these strategies and stand by them and support them. So I think from that perspective, there's a lot out there where we really need to understand the data science, right, to bring it into strategic decision making in human resources.
Absolutely, thank you. So let's jump into our second question. So and this is somewhat related to some of the comments that all three of you have just made. What is the greatest challenge today for our HR leaders in regards to talent as well as recruitment analytics, and how can these challenges be overcome? So one of the challenges we just started to touch upon was around AI and the use of AI. Tracey, we'll start with you.
Sure. So I think there are many challenges. I'll talk about one that I see as a pretty big one. Is there is so much data out there, and there's so much potential to kind of accumulate more and more data and analyze that I think I get concerned that we need to make sure we're being purposeful and thoughtful and using the data that actually is going to help us as a business to drive strategy, to make business decisions. The last thing I ever want to do is like present, a PowerPoint chock full with information to my business leaders and them say, that's really nice, but like, what do you want us to do with this? How does this actually help us? And I myself, right, I'm sort of tempted sometimes. It's about the quantity of the data, like, look at all this stuff I can tell you about this and that. But if it's not really driving strategy or helping us make thoughtful, purposeful decisions, it's just kind of noise. So I think we need to make sure we're, focusing on what can really drive the needle for us and not giving into that temptation just to like put data out there. Look at all the stuff we can come up with if it's not really helping us as an organization.
Thank you, Tracey. I think that's called what? Analysis paralysis?
You summed up all my talking in 2
Yes.
words.
Dr. Donald, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, and I like the term you used there, Monique, analysis paralysis. The other key point that you brought up, Tracey, that I always think of the biases. There's so much going on right now. When you look back, having been in corporate America now for over 30 years, I look at the testing that was done back 30 years ago. There was so much inherent biases. I'm glad now with the organization that I work for, we don't use testing. We use more so credentialing and credentializing experience that people bring to the table versus testing itself. So I'm really happy we haven't gone down that path because of the inherent biases that can occur if you use testing when it comes to people joining an organization.
Yeah, I'll actually take your thought a little forward, Donald. Thank you for giving me the segue. Now, my concern mostly, and again, you're going to hear me talk a lot about the statistical part of using data, primarily because of my limitations of being an industrial organizational psychologist, right? To kind of learn the tricks of the trade and how do you use data rightfully, right, to drive people decisions. I think one of the biggest challenges we have is we are inundated with fast evolving technology that is brought to us with a lot of promises on how that can change the world of managing our talent and human resources functions and do miracles for the organization, right? I think that's where it starts. And then you feel like you got to do something with that technology that's out there because otherwise you're behind. But the biggest challenge with talent and recruitment technology is if we just stay with the example of AI, which we've talked about so far, right? And we look at the not the brighter side of AI. Of course, it brings a lot of good things to us. Behind the scenes, how were those algorithms designed and developed? And of course, there's a lot of debate around that, right? Now, most of the organizations, if we go by, the Deloitte study that I shared, which is only 23% of organizations are at that level where they can truly claim that they are driving people decisions with people analytics. The rest of us, we really need that inside expertise. You don't have to be a statistician, right, to drive people analytics, but you really need to understand, right, what the data that's sitting in the data warehouse, just 1 or 2 or 3 variables brought together is not a complete story to confidently say that if you implement a talent strategy, it's necessarily going to give you a certain kind of decision, right? That's basically, the advanced people analytics component where you bring all of these data sets together, right? And then you truly go through a statistical process to realize and say affirmatively that you can predict this, right? I've done flight risk studies for nurses and, working in healthcare. And you should be able to predict it, but then with confidence, right? And that's where the whole challenge is. Even with AI, right? They're only taking to determine who is the best recruit, they're taking the best performers. They're taking the profile of the best performers and defining who your best recruiters are. And that's a partial analysis, right? You get to look at the contrast between your good performers, not so good performers, before you build that best recruited person's profile. So again, there's a lot of details out there that we don't talk about, and sometimes it becomes, follow the fad, right? And you need to pause and really reflect on how do you want to go about building that function in your organization.
Yeah, that's a great point, Actor. The other thing that I would just add is also to data. It's just that it's data. It's a data point, and we're supposed to use it to drive business outcomes and make informed decisions. But I think sometimes what people may lose sight of is that you need multiple points of data, right? So if you're in your example, if you're trying to build a profile of a particular type of candidate, in your example it was a recruiter, okay, the performance is one data point, but then there could be other factors that play into whether or not, how successful that recruiter is. They may have not filled the highest number of requisitions, but the requisitions that they worked on were quite senior and complex. And there were market factors that had an impact on the volume versus, the level or the quality of the candidate that they've been able to source. So I say all that to say, it's a number of different data points that need to be factored into when you're building different profiles like that. So let's move on into our third question. Our third question is, have you seen or can you share any innovative data-focused talent strategies that companies are using? And what's working, what's been successful in your experience? Ekta, we'll start with you.
Yeah, well, there are a couple of organizations. I'd say, for this question, the best data-focused innovative strategies, if I have to bring an example, I'd bring examples of those who've done it right, and who've done it like holistically. So one of the case studies I read was about Walmart, right? Walmart, it's a retail giant. They've actually used artificial intelligence. They've implemented an AI-based employee scheduling system. And it optimizes their schedules based on employee availability, the workload, and store traffic. Now, that is talent management, right? But imagine within that AI function to bring it to this level of where it's really working for them to take into consideration all the variables that, if you weren't having that function, you would really have your management and leadership looking at all of those considerations to be deciding, how you're going to schedule people. That's a big one, actually. Google, I can talk about Google for hours, but Google's the most widely known organization. I think it's number one. I follow a lot of what's happening in Google's people analytics area because, there have been case studies that have shown the reason why Google is where Google is because they have the top-notch people analytics function, right? Where people analytics reports directly to the CHRO, and all of their talent decisions are actually made based on the research they do with their own employee data in regards to the turnover, in regards to engagement, in regards to motivation. And, there's a very famous, I believe it was Project Oxygen, where, they started with this whole data analytics function to define effectiveness of a manager and came with eight top competencies of managers who drive productivity in employees, who drive retention in employees, right? And who actually create that kind of work environment. And it was a very famous study. IBM is another organization. They actually have I think they call it IBM Talent Frameworks. It's a developmental platform. And what they do with that is really using advanced data analytics for personalized learning and development opportunities. They do career pathing. They're very, very successful in doing career pathing with that talent platform, and also the job matching. So that's an internal mobility kind of a opportunity, looking at skills that employees bring, and then, what are the different opportunities that are available within the organization? How do you map that so that you can carve a career path within the organization? Those were some of the big ones. One more that I actually came across was Hitachi, which actually was like pretty impressive. Hitachi basically said, they altered the way you define productivity, right? So there are traditional ways of measuring productivity that finance typically puts in place based on their financial measures, right? Hitachi said, we're going to define productivity based on happiness index, right? Very innovative, right? And to define that happiness index, of course, they use technology, they use data. There was a mobile, app, and they had some mobile devices that the employees were wearing, and they were actually prompting the employees throughout the day with motivational things and things that bring elevate your mood. And what they were doing with that is they were basically tracking, if you are able to keep your employees happy, they're down, and you give them a stimuli, right? Give them a motivational thought, and you bring their mood up, and you create a culture of worker happiness, your productivity will increase. And they aligned that actually to how they were tracking productivity. Their sick calls reduced. I believe they saw somewhere in the range of 30 to 35% increase in their productivity metrics based and directly correlated with worker happiness. That's what I call innovation, right? I mean, most of the organizations are so stuck in the traditional productivity metrics. And honestly, I don't even know if it gives you the full information of, right? Because it's so much driven by how finance sees productivity and all the financial tools that are out there. So if you want to really tie productivity to the work environment, you want to tie productivity to how you're driving engagement, how you're driving motivation, you really need to think outside of the box in regards to what are the reasons that are limiting the work productivity, and how can you actually use data directly coming as feedback from your employees, right? To then change the work environment, change the semantics for them, to then result in higher productivity. It's just a couple of organizations that I track and follow for the wonderful things they do with people analytics.
Thank you, Ekta. So based on some of the examples that you just provided from like Google and some of the other organizations, this is a good segue into our next question. Which technologies would you say are game changers for interpreting and applying human capital analytics to make more strategic, people-related decisions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I was studying that, Monique, and actually tying into what Ekta just discussed. There's so many different things that are going on out there right now in corporate America, especially when it comes to talent. One key item is, if you looked at 20 years ago within major organizations, if you looked at resumes of individuals and you looked at their tenure in jobs, the longer tenure they had with companies was an indication that they would be more successful. However, now that's changed significantly. Where once used to be a way of weeding out a candidate, now it's totally different because pensions have changed. There are very few companies that have pensions. There are 401ks that are transferable and also portable. But a couple of items that I had on that, I said the technologies out there that can be helpful are a correlation of revenue, a direct correlation to revenue, and then also to people and to headcount. So optimizing your staff with revenue is critical so you don't wind up with reductions in forces. Right now, it's a people market right now, more so than an employer market. The shrinkage in the labor force is upon us. The fastest growing industries out there right now for small businesses are women-owned businesses and minority-owned businesses. So companies that actually know how to treat their employees well and are very open-minded, those will be the ones that will succeed. A couple of other key bullet points: being aware of the oscillations of change are much narrower than they were 20 to 25 years ago. And what I mean by that is, when you look at how change used to be years ago, the dynamics were much, much wider. Now they're a lot more narrower and they move very fast. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Also, understanding how not to have too many non-revenue generated type roles. People are trying to, and companies are trying to keep their expense ratios down. It's really important that you understand, how do you measure that? And how do you make sure that you don't have too much expense versus the amount of revenue you're bringing in? The last point I wanted to make is understanding your staff. Having a really good HRIS system is critically important. This foundation can help with budgeting, as well as to get to know your people extremely well for a greater opportunity for you to retain talent. Those are my responses.
I would, hearing what Ekta had to say in response to the last question and then what Donald just said, one thing that comes to mind for me is in order to either develop these innovative strategies or rely on all this great technology out there, I think companies really need to make a commitment, right, in resourcing and time in this area and see that, the upfront expense is going to pay dividends in the long run in developing these strategies. And, I love the happiness factor for the workforce and tying that to productivity. I mean, that's like amazing. But like, right, that requires a real commitment from the company and at the highest levels, because I think we've all seen, too often that, when we have to look at resourcing, sometimes, some of these more innovative and less tangible aspects of what we're doing are the first kind of to be looked at, like, is that necessary or not? So we really need to build the case for it. These strategies and the commitment to it are absolutely necessary, for the good of, the entire organization. And I think sometimes, that gets lost. So it's that commitment from, the top of the organization down to really invest in these type of strategies, I think is critical.
Absolutely. So we're going to begin to wrap up so that we have some time for some questions. I've seen a couple of really good questions coming through the chat. So our last question for our panelists is, what are the top 2 or 3 aspects of data that HR leaders should be focused on today and why? Tracey, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I'll kick it off. Here's one that I think about quite a bit is, there's a lot of different tools out there now that can measure employee productivity, or I think we were even talking about in one of our sessions with this group about how there's, we can measure whether our employees are looking, right, based on what they're doing on LinkedIn. So retention issues, but, so that's, it's obviously a source of data, but I think we need to think about, does that align with, kind of who we are as an organization and our organizational values, and not forget about, there's a lot of information, but are we using it in a way that's consistent with, who we want to be as an organization? And I think we need to think about that more. It's, the kind of human element to all of this technology and data that's out there, and not lose focus of, we may have the potential to get this data, but is that really, do we really want it? Do we really want to know all this? And does that kind of conflict with some of our values as an organization? And I think that's going to be very different for, every organization, but it's something I think about a lot.
Well, that's really great, Tracey. What you just said is so important, and I don't think many organizations think about that. In regards to the aspects of HR that HR leaders should be focused on, I think, I called out the challenges we have in today's age for HR leaders is there's a lot out there, right? But you could be totally having a large gap with what's going on based on your maturity of where you are with utilization of data. There's no dearth of data. There's a lot of data. You have tons of data in your data mart. The problem is really, how are you using it, right? And do you have the expertise in the organization to use it the right way? And I think for me, the first step to really do is assess, right, with the data acumen you have within human resources. I think one of the challenges with the HR function has been, yes, there's a lot out there, but we're limited to be using only the technology that is already defined and that the vendor can derive reports for us and tell us how we are doing, right? We need to shift that to be able to have a data acumen internally to define how we are doing and where do we want to go. And I believe that for all human resources departments, especially if you're still on the descriptive data stage, right? If you want to go to the diagnostic stage, which is determining cause and effect relationship or correlations within different variables and things happening within the organization, or you want to go to the predictive, you really have to first upskill the data acumen in your human resources function. And I think that's a huge gap. You need to cultivate that data savvy HR function. And then one of the biggest thing is I believe that the talent function and the use of data and people analytics, HR leaders and HR talk about it a lot, but there's a disconnect because you don't connect it with the business, right? And to connect it with the business, the place where it starts is that you have to sell the value of people analytics. You have to sell the value of data analytics to the business so that they understand how they can drive better people and business outcomes, right? So I just think that there's a lot of work still to be done in regards to that journey, where HR is not just talking about HR's data and people data, within the HR leadership teams, but you're actually generating confidence in the business. Examples like Google, examples like IBM, right? Drive your business decision based on what your data is telling you, right? But then for you to do that, first establish that HR function with data savviness, data acumen, having the right skill set, and shift the way you talk about talent and you talk about people strategies within human resources. And once we get to that point, then certainly everything that's out there, you can really leverage that and use that very effectively, to move the needle, honestly, on for the business, not just for talent.
Donald, do you have anything to add in terms of your 2 or 3?
Yeah, I saw Nick's message up there. Yeah, the only thing I would say is to add on to what my colleagues were saying here, those 2 or 3 aspects of data, is that when you take a look at what companies are doing right now, is to be proactive in how you look at what you are presenting to your audience, meaning your employees. Sometimes it's not always wise to be first. And I saw that quite a bit in the last maybe 4 years, especially after the COVID pandemic. And what I mean by that is compromising your overall culture of an organization. The company I work with now, we really don't hone in on what other companies are doing as much as what really sets us apart from the competition.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to jump into the Q&A. We have 4 questions that have come in through the chat. I'm going to work my way back because I think the more recent questions are based on what we just discussed. So the first question is, for organizations looking to embark on the journey of implementing talent analytics, what advice does the panelists have for maximizing value derived from data-driven decision-making?
I'm happy to jump in. I would say to make sure you're investing in, high quality resources that can actually analyze this data, right? Again, it's like there's a lot of sources out there for data, but you need somebody who's an expert, quite frankly, in analyzing that. And that's a skill, and it's a skill to invest in to make sure you're using the data appropriately and in a way that makes sense for your organization.
That's actually, it hits the nail on the head, Tracey. I don't know if I would add anything to that, but the only other thing I would, which is really more expansion of what Tracey said, is understand where are your biggest problems, where are your biggest talent problems, right? And that's going to give you a head start for where do you want to start from. It's very common for all organizations to start with recruiting, just because there's in the world of data analytics and technology, you feel the most solutions offered are in the area of recruiting. There's a lot of work that happens in that area, but I think customizing it to exactly, the issues going on in your industry, and then how those issues are localizing within your organization. First, define it, and once you've defined it, then it's easy to carve a pathway, right, to make data-driven decision making.
I would add to that, Ekta, to say yes, recruitment, talent analytics, but the other area where I see as well is around development. I think it was Tracey or I can't recall who, that talked about career pathing. Coming out of the pandemic, and as you mentioned, we are an employee-driven market versus employer-driven, and what today's workforce, particularly our younger workforce, is demanding and looking for, it's really not about the money or some of those other types of things that aspects that they would look for in an employer. It's more around, okay, so it's not about so much about the money, but if I come and work for you, how are you going to develop my career? How are you going to invest into me? What are the opportunities if I decide to stay here? What my career path look like, you know, with your organization? And so how do we use data for that? I think there's an opportunity there, and that's a really it's become more important recently now with today's workforce.
Yeah,
Okay.
one quick item that I had on that one too, if you don't mind, Monique, is that also being committed to the success of the individual. And that's a lot different than it was 10 years ago again. Now, one thing I try to coach our leaders on is that if we're committed to the success of the individual, first of all, they will hopefully succeed. But if they don't succeed, I want to make sure that my leaders can rest their heads at night to say, we've done everything we possibly could do to make sure that that person can be successful.
Absolutely. Okay, our next question is, how can talent analytics be used to identify and address specific challenges within the workforce? Like, do we have specific examples that we can share?
Well, I can take that, Monique. I have to go back a couple of years, my Stanford days, where we actually, I mean, there were two things that we did in regards to talent analytics. One was actually a nursing flight risk study, right? Like 20 different variables brought together, a humongous task just because it's there in the data mart. And one of the biggest problems with a lot of, you know, what we do with technology is lack of integration across systems. So it's not easy to bring all the data together. But if you're successfully able to, which we didn't do it in-house, you know, I actually partnered with a consulting firm and we had to send the file, you know, with all the variables they asked for. But depending on a lot of different variables, their tenure, their salary, their engagement score, right? A lot of the factors that you take into account. This was more a predictive analytics study to see the flight risk of nurses, right? And in a healthcare environment where there's nursing shortage, right? And again, you know, if you have a lot of challenge in recruiting nurses, I'm talking about my Stanford days, so it's the Bay Area, right? Silicon Valley, very challenging from a cost of living perspective to even recruit nationally. So that was one of the specific challenge we addressed, but that was more retention, recruitment kind of a thing. Another one, you know, that I've successfully done is using a lot of variables in the organization to form a study to reduce leave of absences, right? So where are the leave of absences coming from? When you talk about stress claims and when you talk about, you know, relationship between managers and employees not going back and going good, there are a lot of outcomes based on absenteeism and, you know, how employees are wanting to be in the work environment or not wanting to be in the work environment. In healthcare industry, we also have a lot of injury prevention things, right? Slip, trips, falls, and all of those things. So they also influence your leave of absences. So that study that we did, it was really more part of our, we had a program for workforce planning. It was more part of that in regards to looking at an area of the organization where LOAs were really going high. So taking into account all of these variables and determining where is this coming from, and then how do you implement certain interventions, right, in the work environment, once you've identified what's causing it. And then it was successful. Actually, I did a keynote on that at Human Capital Institute, you know, data analytics conference, and it's a really, really good study if you really have that data savviness and you can bring things together.
Yeah, particularly again, in this environment, you know, we're coming out of the pandemic. It's been 3 or 4 years, but in the area of wellness and well-being, like you mentioned, leave of absences, that's something in the past, a few years ago that we did. We saw a spike in the leave of absences, and we really tried to understand what was the cause of a leave of absence around mental health, stress, burnout, well-being, and then how can we put measures in place around our programs, you know, benefits that we're offering, leave time, things of that nature to try to address the spike and the reasons and the causes as to why we're seeing leave of absences increase. So, and I find that now that's more of a concern now, given the current environment that we're in coming out of the pandemic. So. Okay, our last two questions. Are there specific strategies for using data for a more diverse and equitable workforce? Donna, I'll ask if you can take a stab at answering that one.
Yeah, again, when it comes to data, and especially when you look at the diverse workforce that we have, more so than ever before, I'm really cautious as to how we use data. And it's really important that we don't use what I call the biases or introduce biases that could, it's very few companies that are using biases like they did years ago. So when it comes to overall strategies and things that can be done overall, it starts off first with the type of questions that we ask people who are looking to come into the organization, and making sure we ask the right type of questions so we can make sure that those individuals feel comfortable with us as well as us with them. For long service employees, a different ballgame. Some of them are attached to various type of programs, especially when it comes to compensation, things of that nature, that kind of hold them down. But don't underestimate that. Making sure that, we make sure we give the right type of attention and not just assume or take for granted those long service employees, and making sure that we're engaged with them also.
And then our last question for today, how can we be sure that our analytics strategies remain agile and adaptable to evolving workforce needs, and any common pitfalls to avoid? I'll ask all of you to kind of chime in and answer that one.
I'll start. I would say it's key to have multiple data sources in this regard, right? So you're not just reliant on one source. And I also think this goes to what you just said, Donald, about how do we use data to create a diverse and equitable workforce. If we're just relying on one data source, right, chances are, you may be missing something. So the more you can have a variety, a diverse pool of information, I think the better off any organization will be as they're dealing with, any sort of talent issue.
Yeah, I was just going to say one thing too, is the way in which we used data in the past was so biased. Now, and it was also used in such a way to try to screen people out. And I tell you, that mindset has really changed. So it's really important that when we look at data, we look at information, we look at analytics, we make sure that the human factor sometimes can be unpredictable. So have to be careful of how you use the analytics and the data overall, making sure you weed out the biases.
Right, because you don't want to have a situation where you are negatively or you are disadvantaging or having a negative impact, correct, unintentional on a particular community. I would also add that with regards to data, and you're trying to use that data to not only drive business outcomes and decisions, but also, our workforce engagement, and how do we make this the best place to work and the best place that it can be, and have people have that connection and that feeling, right? Whenever you're about to implement something or do something new, I always say, talk to the community or the population that is going to be impacted as a result of whatever it is that the change that you're going to make or what you're going to implement. Because you will find that we sometimes go off and think, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, this is what the data is telling us is going to be cool and great. And then when you do it, the feedback and the response is not what you anticipated, because I just think that you missed the step up front of actually engaging and asking the employees or the population in the community that this is going to impact. So, any closing thoughts?
Well, wonderful answers from all of you. I support everything you've said. No, nothing to add, Monique. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. I want to give a round of applause and thank our panelists for joining us today. This was a great and wonderful conversation. Nick, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. And thank you all for such an insightful panel discussion. That was great. And I want to thank everyone else for joining us today. This session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event.